Okay. Good. Well, welcome back to the physical space. I know the one that I put in for you was the small world thing, which actually, it's a big deal to me personally. So I hope you're able to take that in as a kind of a fantastic history of science kind of moment there, or period, where that and the scale-free network story basically started this whole complex networks business, which continues to kind of get out of hand, basically. But and I want to say, and it's in those slides, and it's core to the models we built, and so on, and some of the other stuff I'll show you. But groups, right? So the networks, but groups are the really key thing. So there's lots of beautiful stuff we can do with simple networks where the nodes are individuals, but I think that's what I would exhort you to kind of work on as much as possible is kind of identifying the group structures that are important to whatever you're thinking about. If it's spreading, of course, functionally now we're basically a group, right? So that's why we have the little snout cover things on. I got mistaken for someone the other day at the Santa Fe Institute for the person at the front, because it's partly this. But then I met that person. I'm like, okay, not bad. Good nose. So I might be one of the very few people, because I don't get that much. I don't get the doppelganger thing. My wife looks like a lot of people, including her twin sister. So it's kind of a start for her there. She's used to it. Anyway, so yeah, but groups. All right. So that's just, and the problem is it's a bit harder. It's harder. It doesn't have the analytic stuff can be harder. So because we like to go off with the math forever, we can get a little too far away from that. But it's what you should be working on. And of course, sociology, right? So socio is group, right? It is this study of groups. And also how to be upset about everyone else for like taking over your field or something, or perceiving that. All right, so Vermont, good stuff. So this was while I was away. We notched up some good counting there. And I think that's this is an average, like a week scale average. And if you go down into here and look at the last 90 days, there was a record here of, what is it, 527. Of course, cases are different in what they imply, in terms of hospitalization than they were early on when we weren't measuring cases, but perhaps we were getting to this. But it's really deaths. I'm going to talk more about this on I think Thursday. I'll go through the sort of historical work on this, which again will have groups at the core of it, but will be a network story. And then I think I wanted to but I just wanted to bring this back. I mean, I could have talked about this every day, and it would be, you probably would have, been very upset. But I think so the economists, of course, you have to pay for, but I'm pretty sure this is open for everyone. And we've looked at this, but I just want to sort of show you where we are now. It's been up, it's updated. When's the last update? Last update is November 8th. So that doesn't mean, of course, every country's updated. So if you look at this, you'll see, this is the last data point for Bulgaria. This whole page is about excess deaths, right? Which generally countries are reasonably good at measuring. So you can see the darker colors are where there's and really, all the terrible things going on. Peru has a fantastic measurement system, actually. They've done a good job. It's terrible what happened in Peru, but they've been accurate in recording the death toll. And just to sort of show you where things are, this has all been very hidden early on, but it was clear. So early on, Russia had fewer counts than Iceland. I remember sort of pointlessly tweeting these kind of little examples of like how we have no idea what's going on. I think Russia, India, they had less total cases than Iceland, and clearly that was not what was going on. But you see, this is the excess deaths, so this is above normal. So Russia is continuing to climb, and if you look at Russia's data recently, it's like this. So, the US going into a bit of a trough. We have the holidays, which is a nice approximation of random mixing that we like to partake in. And Thanksgiving, of course. So that last year, kicked the thing up. So hopefully it won't be as strong, but as something we'll come back to is assortative mixing. So birds of a feather kind of story, which you have in networks, you have in with people, that people tend to. So if you have, right, we have some level of vaccination in the US. It varies tremendously across states, as we know, and there's a partisan divide has really become clear. The concern I would have is that unvaccinated people will be more likely to be next to unvaccinated people, which I think is, I don't know what the data is on that, but that's that's assortative, right? So in that dimension, possibly other dimensions, people are matching up. And that's different to the case of unvaccinated people being randomly assigned to the whole population. That would be a different thing. And a lot of sort of models might presume that when it comes to, herd immunity and so on. But if you have clusters, right, this is also how cults start, how all sorts of things can go wrong. Singapore had trouble early on with COVID because, it's a very rigid kind of country, lots of laws being enforced, so they did a good job. But it turns out that they also, the immigrant workers, or not, this is a bad part of their culture, right? Those people are sort of housed together very tightly, and so things started to spread through that group. So, of course, this won't happen, but I mean, even if you're a selfish large nation, you would want to vaccinate the world just so that just for your own selfish purposes, you have a better, safer environment around you. So, but anyway, that's a struggle. Okay, but Russia, I don't know where Russia's going to end up. Bulgaria, the Balkans really have been kind of extraordinary. This is Macedonia. So these numbers here, this is getting up. This is about 1 in 160 people have died, right? So that's, 1 to 10% is really a historic, something horrific. The numbers are unclear, perhaps for 1918, but they're kind of enormous. And the estimates, again, from The Economist, which I think have done the best job, sort of 95%, or maybe 10 to 20 million people have died, right, in excess. Very hard to figure out, but it's not 5 million. It's more. It's 10 to 20. Anyway, so you can see all of these have different patterns, and if you go through this, again, this is something you can easily find. You can see the data is reasonably well sort of recorded in states here. You can I'll just sort of flash down to show you where. So you see Poland, right? This is the actual number in pink here, and the real excess deaths. So you can see that we're not tracking properly, which is completely understandable early on. I think Russia. See Russia here. You can see the partial data that's involved. Belarus, which was running around saying it was totally fine and they're like immune because of their characters. This is the leaders. We just don't even have data beyond March of this year. So this becomes hard to kind of characterize. This Tajikistan. Who knows? Then you see the terrible thing. South America, absolutely disastrous. Peru really kind of tracked it well. Awful thing that happened. But somewhere like Ecuador did not and has really enormous numbers. Anyway, it continues, and we're going into the winter, and I don't know. I will say traveling, everyone had a mask on, except for one douchebag, who was like, a lot of people stared at that douchebag. Anyway, it's like, at Chicago airport or whatever. Yeah, there's a lot of people. But so that was good, actually kind of a little bit grown up. All right. Let me splash that out. So I will quickly say, I had a good trip to the Santa Fe Institute, and the reason that matters to us is it's the origin really for so much, and of course the Vermont Conflict System Center. That's the origin story is really this book. So this is Waldrop, but it's 1993. It must be some reprint cover, which is the distraction. But it was handed to me by this guy here, Marakov. He's got some stupid things, but he was a friend of mine at college, at Trinity College, which we went to Melbourne Uni. And so he was doing medicine, right? So other countries, I think everywhere, you go out of high school, you go straight into the field, right? So if you go from high school and the next year you're, cutting up cadavers in your first year of 7 years of becoming a doctor. Anyway, he's a brain surgeon now, which he describes as some kind of video game, which worries me a little bit. But anyway, he handed me this book and said, forget about chaos, even though it's in the title, because that had been a really compelling book for a lot of people. James Gleick's book, which was really inspirational. But that was actually about a field that had been sort of really well explored. So if you read it, it's a fantastic science. But this was much more messier, and we don't know where we're going. And of course, this is 1992. But it's about the Santa Fe Institute. So yeah, I read this book and I'm like, I will go to the US instead of England, right? I mean, I had a choice, a bifurcation. I could have gone to different Trinity College, one in Cambridge. So anyway, so a bifurcation of existences. But that's that was the inspiration for me. And of course, I went to MIT just to tell you this, to do my PhD, and I was going to work with Steve Strogatz. It's a story I tell people a lot. But I walked in the very first day. I handed my master's in Australia on the Friday. I flew over the weekend. I'd never been anywhere apart from New Zealand. And I walked into the math office, which was like a 1950s kind of Brazil, the movie style situation. It was a little jarring, and said, "Where is Strogatz's office?" And they said, "Cornell." The woman just said, flatly, "Cornell." I'm like, okay, that's not great. Maybe you saw that in the thing. I don't know. So that was a change. And then I met people, and they're like, let us say complexity. Just don't. No. Like a lot of people had this back then. Like, why would you destroy your career? Think about these things. No, it's true. I mean, people really, you can't do this. One professor, I remember, he did tell me how he was determined to, he had been incredibly determined to prove Ed Lorenz wrong, who is sort of his work started the whole chaos business. His work, along with several women who were unnamed and unknown for decades, until actually my former advisor found out that there was more than one person involved with that paper, which is a whole story. You can look this up. Dan Rothman did a good job of unearthing them and interviewing one of the people who was still around. Anyway, yeah. So it was, yeah. And I said I was interested in linguistics, and they're like, no, no, you must do fluid mechanics. Yeah, interesting. So we've persevered, and over time done lots of interesting things, and we have a center with a whole education program. So I'm going to plop this one in. This is a set of slides that kind of goes it's basically the top of a mountain. You can get to it from an optimal network story, right? So we can think about what are the principles that can give rise to what we might think are optimal networks, like blood networks in your body, brains. Like what are these things doing something that's optimal? So that's a challenge, right? Even just the forks in blood networks, or the forks in water structures, hydrology. What have we built with these things? So that's like building up from like junctions up to bigger and bigger systems and bigger and bigger systems. So that's one way to get to this, because it's about supply networks. And the other way is really, and this is still, I don't think, properly elucidated, but it's the highly optimized tolerance leads into this as well, right? So that's about equipartitioning of risk, and I think there's a similar story here. So I'll tell you about that. So it's another scaling story, and I'll show you some really beautiful things here. So it's going to be about 2D. We think we can jump and stuff like that, but we're pretty stuck in the two-dimensional part. But you can generalize to other things. So we're going to think about this. Hospitals, and I sort of tried to do it in the spring, but if for those of you who come back in the spring for POX2, there's a human rights aspect to that, and that's one of the sort of major directions we want to kind of build. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that. But so, where do you put hospitals? And maybe you didn't put them there. Maybe it's all being done locally and organically. Post offices, pubs. I'll see if I can dig up that. There's a fantastic body of work that's been done on from back to the 1700s of post offices in the US, right? Just where they were. When they went away, you can see the arrival of vehicles, right? Because there's sort of there's the growth of states that go, across the US. They don't make that sound, but they go across the US like this, and then fill in, becomes very dense, and then, because it's horse and carts and that sort of thing, and eventually through the 20th century, you start to see them become sparser. But that's a kind of incredible temporal evolution of a system where you have people, moving into different places. It's a complicated history. And then you have to put facilities, right? Now, some of those facilities are McDonald's, right? Or Walmart, right? Vermont was the last state to get a Walmart. Not because we're special, just because we're a long way from Arkansas. Trucks take a long time to get here. All right. So, right, obviously, we don't sort of just want to put a hospital every 10 miles or something like that, right on a grid. You could do that if you're a funny government. But people are just, right, we've talked about how we get these kind of skewed distributions for so many things. And one of them, of course, is where people live for cities. So if density is uniform, then it'd be a uniform thing. Yes.
Isn't that how like cities were made, like in the U.S., like for towns? For some president, like they like really made cookie cutter, like cities had like the churches here, the schools here, like.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, obviously in the East, it's more different, right? I mean, it's messy and higgledy-piggledy, like it grew much more organically. But as you go further out west, it's laid out. And in the north part of Manhattan, grid. It's like let's do some top-down planning. And then if you wander down into the below Houston, you're like, I don't know where I am anymore. Um, so it varies, it varies, and different cities around the world have been planned more or less. So Washington, it's got real structure to it. Canberra, Burley Griffin was the architect for that, and is an American architect, and it's all circles. It's incredibly confusing, but if you live there, it's spectacular. Like it's really good. People know exactly what they're doing. But if you first come in there, it's tough. Cambridge and Boston, right? So I lived there for 6 years and rode my bike around and trying to not get killed mostly. It was really very much life or death. I have vivid memories of like being in the snow and like laying it out and just looking behind while I'm skating along for like 30 feet and there's a car. Anyway, so just stuff happened. Um, I think I was only hit by one BU student in a BMW. That was fun. And then they drove away. So, um, always good. No, terribly dangerous. But I remember sort of someone giving me a list of the reasons why it's structured that way, right? It's not planned. And there's filling in Back Bay, and then that was added some structure and so on. Like they're making this land. There are a few things. That's why it's sort of got weird pieces because this used to be the coastline or whatever. But the best one was that the Puritans wanted to build suffering into the infrastructure, and they succeeded. So, if density is uniform, then you would you'd sprinkle these things out basically, like you said. Which lattice is optimal in 2 dimensions? We'll come back to that. Yeah, hexagons. The bees know what they're doing. There are deep reasons for that. Anyway, so it's uneven, deeply uneven. So what do we do, right? And what happens in terms of what's happened organically versus what would you do if you were planning this thing, right? So this is the first thing is like you want to have fair supply, and so we're going to have a couple of pieces here. Yeah, where's the other one? No, it's not there. So right, so we've got some density, and we're going to put down a facility, and that will generate a Voronoi cell, right? So all of these things, you say, okay, if you start to create these Voronoi cells, which are simply, here's the center of these hospitals, because you could they're not churches, they're hospitals, and then you draw a straight line between them, right? That if you have a line between these two, you want the one that bisects it and is perpendicular. And you draw all of those, and wherever they intersect with each other, that's where they stop. And so in this cell, at least in terms of straight distance, all of these individuals, if you like, they're living in houses. This is their closest facility. So you construct a Voronoi thing, and you can start to look at, well, how big are these? How big are these cells? They have some area. What's the density of people in them? Right. And you can see how you could get this totally wrong, right? So everyone lives over here, and for some reason you put it right. That would be wrong. It wouldn't be fitting. So you've got some population density. We'll call it rho. It's uneven. You've been given resource. So this is going to be similar a bit. It's somewhat like the hot model. The hot model we were worried about for forests. We were worried about keeping the boundaries clean, right? Like making sure that the trees were knocked down with a team of beavers. Well-controlled beavers. You can't control beavers, right? They do what they want. But let's say they're on your team, right? Okay, but these are facilities, so now it's just a point instead of a boundary. It induces boundaries, of course. Right, so one thing to think about is minimize the average distance or maybe time that it takes people to get to the nearest hospital. And then you have to think, you might want to think about, and this comes later, there's work that's only 12 years old now that moved away from that and said, so this is sort of a pro-social thing, right? We're trying to minimize the average distance. You could think about that. So we're trying to help your average person. But if you're McDonald's or Starbucks, that's okay, but you actually just want the most people to come in to be in. So that's why, if you're in a large city, there can be the same franchise can be on, like on a block. There'll be one around the corner, which is upsetting to the franchise owners, but they're just trying to maximize the throughput of the humans. This is another ad for Subway. Okay, so lots of people worked on this. This is Mark Newman and Michael Gassner. Newman, incredibly famous character in networks and in the small world stuff. You'll see that Duncan Watson and I and Mark had a story explaining how small world search works. And because we were both, what we realized, is with small world search, you could, in principle, find anyone, right, with a socio-technical thing. And this is like the wanted posters, if you give people enough incentive, that you could do all this potential good, right? I mean, we got letters from people. There was a guy, really sad things, like his brother had disappeared in Italy in the 50s. He's an Englishman, help me find lost, so it's very meaningful and you want to do it. But the thing I could never really get around was the stalker aspect, right? The bad side to this is just so evident, so we didn't do it. However, Facebook emerged and basically enabled all of that. We'll talk about Facebook again, because Parks has been raging about that since about 2006. Okay, so this is an example. This is based on census data, right? So what's happening here is you actually know where people live based on the 2000 census data. So that's in the background. So that's the fixed thing. So that's like the lightning distribution for the hot model, right? People aren't the dangerous things here, but it's the background distribution that you're worried about. So it's sort of flipped to it's all about cost and benefit and those sorts of things. This has a different look to it. You're trying to benefit the individuals. And now you've got 5,000 facilities you can put down. And so how do you do that to minimize the average distance? And so it's going to become more sparse out here where fewer people live. So it is a long way. If you live in this cell and this is your nearest facility, it's a long way to get there, right? So it's true. But what we're trying to do is minimize the average. And what you tend to see is as you become more, so this is a pro-social thing, as you become pro-profit, these cells get bigger. And we'll see that later on. These cells get bigger, these ones get tighter, because you want to put more McDonald's in there. So this is, these points in here are not real, they're artificial, right? This is for a particular, 5,000 was just a choice, we're just going to put them down. And so you can see they clump around where all the cities are, of course. Okay, so they're going to be funny little Voronoi cells, right? They're different shapes and sizes. If this was a perfect thing, you'd have hexagons, so that's something to think about. But what you do have now is there's some population in this piece, in this little cell. There's one facility, and there's whatever that population is divided by the area is the local density. So we kind of have 5,000 data points of what's the local density. And so if you plot these things together, the population density like this, and then the facility density. So as you increase, right, so this is going from very rural, or not even just rural, but like desert land sort of thing, out to quite, and this is, what do we got, 6 orders of magnitude? Yeah. I guess, yeah, all right, 5, 6. Then, so the density is changing a lot, of course. Then the density for facilities goes up, and this is just a simple fit. It's rho to the 0.66. So if you're a physicist and you think you know everything about the world, because you look at that number and you get excited because you think it is 2/3, which is then what? What is it?
Golden ratio?
No, it's not a golden ratio. No, it's 2/3. It's definitely 2/3. Mathematician, you would do that. Yeah. Which is very joyful, of course, right? Because they've got We got, continued fractions. Who's done? Who knows about continued fractions? This is how we know the. This is why we have a leap year every 4 years, but not every 100 years, but every 400 years. So 2000 was the most interesting year because it was the exception of the exception, etc. Because of a because of a continued fraction. So the golden ratio, you can write it out like this. It's this stack that goes on forever because it solves, what is it? You can see that, right? Have I got it right? Anyway, and then because continued fractions give you the best approximation to irrational numbers, this is fantastic. So you just truncate it. That's the best rational approximation out to some level of error. Then this is the most irrational number because it takes the longest to converge.
In the early 60s, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, my father, who was a physicist, decided to maybe he should move to the place where one was least likely to die in nuclear holocaust. And he figured
New Zealand.
it all out, and using
Yeah.
things like you've been showing him, and drove there to look for real estate.
Oh, it had to be in the U.S.
It was in the U.S.
Yeah.
They were eating lunch in a diner, and these military trucks
Yeah. Sorry.
he asked the waitress what was going on, and he said, "Well, the military's building a base here."
Okay.
Which is made him done the same calculation.
We'll blow up some nuclear things here. Oh my God. Yeah, you got to be careful, right. So everyone ends up on New Zealand, and they're all Peter Thiel and all the billionaires or whatever. It's like, yeah. Some will end up on Mars, which will end badly, obviously. Well, we can only hope. Keep subscribing to Amazon, right? We'll get Bezos up there eventually. Just 10 seconds is not enough. Okay, so whatever. So okay, so it's 2/3. What is the 2 and what is the 3? What could they be? Dimensions. So they could be. It could be. So it's 2/3, right? It could be like d minus 1 over d. So that could be like a 3-dimensional one, right? So that would be 3 minus 1, or it could be d over d plus 1, where d is 2. And then it might generalize, right? So this is just in 2 dimensions, it might generalize. So it's a pretty good fit. Of course, part of this, this was a model, right? So they did some kind of optimization thing to kind of allocate these facilities. Simulated annealing kind of thing, I think, right? So they sprinkle them around and then kind of jostle them around until it gets this quantity that you're trying to minimize decreases. So it looks good for 2/3 power, and so it's a different story. This is the branching network thing, which would connect to, and that's where you have like your heart goes out to the capillaries or capillaries, depending on who told you how to speak, and that's one source to many in 3 dimensions, sinks in 3 dimensions. Now you kind of have a different game. You have sources and sinks. And then on top of that, and that's the last piece of this, on top of that, you have to add, how do you get the coffee? How do you get the supplies? How do you get the whatever to the places, right? So there's a big network on top of that as well. Yeah.
When they were doing this and putting it on the map, what exactly was it just calculation for each hospital? What was their kind of criteria to put each hospital in? This would go through, this would go through.
Yeah, so it's an optimization scheme, and you randomize it to start with. You can do that, but underneath it you grid it, and you'd have what's the local population, and then you do this thing where you'd measure all of these, what's the average distance, and then try to find out which one of these is doing the worst, and then kind of move them around. So there are lots of schemes for doing that, and I don't know exactly which one they use, but they use sort of there's a temperature thing where you kind of make them all jostle around, And then you choose, if it goes, yes, eurythmics, outstanding. Um, uh, but there's, I thought it was sweet cheese to start with, but it's sweet drink. So, yeah, but so underneath it, the population remains fixed. And so you're always trying to move, like you'll move, if it helps you to move this facility this way, the code will do it.
So like,
It's trying to lower the cost.
hypothetically, if the US had the system, do you think like hospital beds in places where COVID got found up in the high population would have been better or worse?
I mean, it's a really good question. So you can, I mean, and that's where the human rights things come in, because there's things like where are voting booths, where's access to particular kinds of care, like lawyers for particular kinds of, like where are they? So which regions are, being helped or harmed relatively, like so Texas, of course, has changed some laws recently, right? So that completely changes the shape there, right? So you do have, not shown here, but you have states with their own rules, which kind of will force some of those things to be really not the right way, or not, not a. So if the scaling is off from 2/3, you can say it's, benefiting, like this is more of a profit thing, and there's some examples I'll have at the end. Yeah. The other thing with hospitals that I've sort of long wondered about, and I think there's some work on it now, but is nosocomial infection, right? So the ones you get inside hospitals, just the layout could be bad, right? So I kind of wanted to get all the blueprints of them and see like what are the rates of infections. Maybe, do you know about this? Julia. Yeah.
So like one of the things I was asking is,
Money.
do we clean this equipment before they go all the way around the entire hospital? And they're like, just wipe the top off. Nobody ever cleans the rest of it. And stuff like that. So it's like, when people are trying to solve these problems, I really think they should just go hang out in the hospital for like a day.
Yeah, that doesn't sound, yeah.
Because it seems insane to me that things like, that we wouldn't try something like, give people 5 more minutes to clean the equipment before it gets moved to the rest of the
just in time, optimize, all the good things. Yeah, no, you should. I mean, and of course that comes out of us managing, like, it's like one character basically who said, maybe we should wash our hands in the middle of the 19th century, and I thought that they were nuts. But that still has been really hard, right? Surgeons, you have to take pictures and you can still, and you need to get, I think, right, the checklist thing maybe works. I don't know. But that's been one shift. Did you wash your hands? Yes. But I mean, it turns out completely the flip. Basic. Sure. Cost money. Right. It might kill some people. Yeah. Yeah. But Okay, so this is a really interesting piece of work. This is just a few pages in. It's in Science, 1977. Looked into Stefan's work. He's a sociologist, I think, at the Western Washington University, which is in Bellingham, I think. And it's interesting. He has some of his private or some of his stuff. He's written books and so on. Basically, how much of a struggle this was for him to, within his department, they just kind of hated this. But he did it. He did some interesting things. So I'll just sort of throw up what he has, and it did get to science, which doesn't mean everything. But he had this kind of idea of a minimal effort thing, right? So let's see if we can do that. The Homer Simpson principle. So we're going to have, he's not going to have something that does the whole system at once. It's just going to be focused on one cell. And I'll just sort of go through this somewhat quickly. So there's a region, it's got some area, there's a population, and there's one center, right? And this you have to kind of try to figure out. His is going to be more on time, not distance. So there's a time that it takes for you to get to a place on average, and there's the time, if you like, that takes to the people that's required collectively to maintain that center. So there's some average distance within the cell from a population. So there's a lot of stuff, if the population density drops away a lot, it's going to be problematic. But if that was true, you'd start to expect to see that this cell should be broken up into smaller pieces. So it's over a reasonably, not too big, sort of a functional size, community size. So there's some speed of travel that gives you a time, right? And then you just sort of assume isometry that the distance will grow like 8.5, right? So area, distance, 8.5. We're not talking about weird allometrically scaling regions. So, so this is per person. There's going to be some constant here. This is for the shape factor. This is 8.5. That's the scaling of the distance divided by some typical speed, right? So if they're driving a car and so on. But 8.5 is that big piece. There's regular maintenance that you just have to kind of, go through to keep this thing going. And if that burden is, so this is, missing a T. If that, there's some population, so you can imagine this is sort of divided up by people. And then the population will replace that. That's some density times the area. So you can sort of see we're starting to get these things. So we're sort of assuming uniform density, or, well, it doesn't change too much. So this total average time cost per person is this sort of expected effort it would take to get to that place. Maybe it's somewhere they're going somewhat regularly. This is a bit of a messy thing. There's maybe some other constants here, some proportionalities. There should be. Yeah, anyway. It's the time divided by the number of people. And then basically the structure is, this is where he really gets out, that there's a cost that grows as the area grows, and there's a cost that decreases as the area grows, right? So there's a limit. If there's just one of you in the population, it takes too much to run this thing. And it's sort of assuming that whatever this facility is, it's not growing with the population. So that's a bit of a funny piece in there as well. But you've now got an 8.5 plus 1 over a, and if you do a derivative, you can see this is going to be something that's going to have a minimum. So that's the game. You do this derivative, so to 0, blah, 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 and then rearrange some things, and you get that the area is going to decay like population to the minus 2/3. And so that the 2/3 is interesting. The half went to a minus a half. Area went to 1 over a, went to 1 over a squared. This is the derivative. And then when you rearrange that half and that a squared give you an a to the 3 halves. 3 halves upside down gives you the 2/3. And then the density of the facility is simply 1 over a, right? There's 1 in the area. So there's 1 divided by a, and then that will make it proportional to the 2/3. So it's a short little game to, it's talking about some kind of optimization that gets out this observed story. It's a bit funny. It's not talking about how they're all connected to each other. And as I said, it's a bit of a funny business. This maintenance is supposed to be, right? So the hospitals are all the same size, or the Starbucks are all the same size. Maybe, for some things, maybe that's not so wrong, right? McDonald's don't grow like factor of 10 or 100 or something like that. Hospitals can get bigger. Right, so this was he had his own magnum opus. Now, what was missed with all of this earlier work, and there were people in geography, sociology, mathematicians, computer science. There were a lot of different people working on this in different ways without realizing it was the same problem. Okay, this is a completely different thing, and I'll connect it back to Mark Newman's stuff. So I think now the world we have cartograms, are the squares for the US or hexagons are pretty powerful, right? They're pretty good at showing us what's going on. But this was a PNAS paper from a few years ago, where the idea was, okay, the problem is, if you're trying to represent something that isn't to do with population, like it's like a rate, for example, within a population, then area, of course, is very confounding, right? And we see this over and over again in the US with the representation of voting, right? Blue and red. It's all basically red with blue spots on it. And, it looks compellingly like it's all red. But if you go to a county level, that changes. And if you do play around with cartograms in some way, which people have done for, again, long time, centuries, really, of course, many centuries, people have messed around with how to represent things, thousands of years on maps. And so the idea is this is rescaled by population. So you can start to see, like, basically, right? So China starts to bulge, Russia has shrunk away, Canada has shrunk away. And the way so it deforms the shapes. And you still have to be able to kind of see where things are. New Zealand and Australia have disappeared, Indonesia has grown enormously. The idea is that basically you put you take the original one and you put the population kind of evenly across this space, and then you make the average population, the sea will have the sort of sea level will be the average population, and then you allow diffusion to happen. So it's an old school physical diffusion, and you let diffusion happen, so it's going to let it go bloop until it equalizes, and then the area becomes reflective of the thing you were talking about. So this area, all these areas now are comparable, right? So this is China versus India. These are comparable. It's going to be deformed and messy and so on. Sri Lanka is this funny little thing. So you're going to see them smooth out, become more round, right? Nigeria dominates. Western Africa, for example, becomes clear. Europe changes, tremendously. So now we can put all sorts of other things on here. So it's diffusion based, as I said. Just have it up here. You can play around with this. I think it's okay. It's okay. So just a few child mortality. So you can, it's powerful. It does, of course, change them tremendously. You wonder about some of the reporting in some places. Energy consumption, different again. So this is Africa. This is piece here. Japan, enormous. Again, by certain measures. Gross domestic product, very similar looking. Yeah, I guess so. Yep. Again, this is from 20 years ago kind of thing, but probably hasn't changed too much. Spending on healthcare. So very different things. It gives you a different kind of map of the world. People living with HIV. Again, very different. So this is turned into a whole thing. I do feel like we've talked about these different maps, but I do think the ones that are just made out of squares and so on are pretty powerful. All right. So all of that is to a really difficult problem. How do you represent space, right? Another way to do it potentially is to have it on a globe. You could imagine a globe you could play around with online or whatever, and have little stacks coming out of it. But we really, 2D is so important to us. We use it at our peril, of course. Okay, so this is what's happened here is taking that method and applying it to that initial layout of facilities, right? That very initial one that I showed you. And sort of the game here is this is if you equalized with respect to population, and if then you say population to 2/3, and you see these are much more even little blobs in here. So this is sort of a way of saying that if you rescaled all of those shapes, you get something that, and you do use 2/3, then you get the right thing. There's some extra pieces in here. This is even a little bit funnier, but basically 120 is the internal angle for hexagons. So it's not that they're all hexagons, but they have a lot more hexagon type structure. So it's a sort of a distorted quasi-hexagonal map. So another derivation, just to show you quickly, and just I think you might see how this connects across to the hot model stuff. So, right, the basic idea was minimize the average distance from random individual to the nearest facility. So we're going to have this fixed population density, and that's like the density of the lightning distribution. And so it becomes a bit more of a game. So this is more elevated than what Stefan did, right, which was sort of focused on one cell, thinking about many of them. But this is going to be the game. It's going to be minimizing this quantity, right? So this is an interesting thing to have done. You've got the density at a point And then this is the minimum. These are xi. This is I is the locations of the facilities. So it's you find the closest one, and then you get a number there. And so this is going to be a kind of an odd quantity because as you go across a boundary in a Voronoi cell, it will be smooth, but you're pointing to a different place. There's some clever things. So this is a P medium problem. It's MP complete or MP hard, whatever problem. Hussein Zaid had a solution in the 80s. That's an obscure paper, which you totally cannot or should never download from Sci-Hub. I wouldn't have done that. So yeah, it's Geographica, Analytica. Did not do that. Yep. Sci-Hub. No. I am speeding through this like a maniac. Sorry. Yeah. 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 If your population density is really odd and uneven, there's one person, like there's one person who lives in the middle of a desert and there's 1,000 miles around them, they're not going to be accommodated. Yeah. So the other thing you could have in here is minimum, and then you could have a cap on it, right? So it'd be maybe less easy to do with mathematically, but you could say like, I don't want anyone. And so in South Korea, I have an example later on where it looks like they kind of did that for some sort of health facilities. They're just like, screw it. We'll put them everywhere. There was another wave.
That reminds me of like the trolley problem on a much larger scale.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just thinking about the good place, but so I'm just trying to get the right one back in my head. Which variation?
Yeah, right. Well, it's just another variation of it, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, sacrifice. Yeah, no, it depends. And these things depends how they get there, right? So you could be someone who's advocating, like your town needs a post office, so it's sort of good, like there's enough of you and you do it, right? Versus Walmart coming in saying, how fortunate you are now, here is a Walmart for you to become a Walmartian. And, so what's interesting is there are lots of different mechanisms giving rise to these distributions of what I'm just generally calling facilities. Yeah, okay. So Voronoi cells, blah, blah, blah. And then you add this little function, which is going to be the area of the Voronoi cell that X is in. So that's going to be, right, so say we have this Voronoi cell here that's got some area A. So, and let's just say A2, and then there's maybe another cell here. And there's facilities like this, we'll call this A1. So if you're on this path here, you wander through here, and you kind of take this out, then the area function, maybe it's like this, like it's A1 and A2, right? So as we'll call this X0, X1, and X2. So this is maybe X2, X1, and X0. Chalk is fun. Okay, so that's not a triangle, it's an area. So as you're kind of wandering along, this function is just stuck because it's just what is the area of the cell you're in. And then as you cross that line, it jumps. The distance to the nearest facility is smooth, right? As you're going through here, it's like, here's the distance, gets a little further away. Now it's equal, and so that wouldn't have a jump in it. But so there's this funny function that's like this. What's going on? What's that? Oh yeah, sure. I will show you. I'm showing you bad ways, but there are other bad ways. No, it's true. I just want to say, this is so you can still have this kind of estimate to the nearest source is this kind of rough thing again, where you just say, okay, in this space, somewhat uniform, maybe a little lumpy, but somewhat uniform. Then the typical distance to here is going to be like this area to a power of a half, roughly. And because all the cells are slightly different, there's no uniform factor here, and that makes it a bit harder. And you just approximate as a constant. And then you'd have one of these Lagrange multiplier things, but we go a little bit further than that. We're trying to minimize this blob because we're just going to say it's so this was this x minus x thing before, but we'll just say it's 8.5. And then some tricky things, right? So there's going to be this constraint that the sum of the areas is equal to the whole area, and we can just go to the points where the facilities are. And then this is a nice little gadgety thing to put in. So there's a constraint that we have n facilities. So that's an important thing you want to put in. And one sneaky way to do it is to make it into an integral and say, if you integrate over 1 over area, so every time you integrate across, as you integrate across this whole space, 1 over area is constant. So, but integrating over here gives you that area, so you get a 1. So each little Voronoi cell, you break it out into each Voronoi cell, and each Voronoi cell gives you a 1. So it's a sneaky way of getting a 1 over A in there. I mean, yeah. So that's a constraint, and then we can do this kind of business, right? So it's a calculus of variations thing. You can set it up as this kind of business. We're trying to minimize this, and then this was a way of putting in the number of facilities as being. So you don't have to worry about this, but it's basic. Yeah, it's very lovely and spectacular and so on. But it's turns out you're basically differentiating the insides of this thing, and you get out the same kind of game again, right? So the population density, 8 to the minus 3 halves. Are we sad? You're not doing it. Don't worry. I just want. It's amazing how much we do get. A lot of these things do have there's an optimization story, which is kind of nice. Okay. All right. Then we rearrange that, and you'll get that same story, right? Basically, the facility density is scaling like this to the 2/3. I mean, I throw this set of slides in here because it's just such a. I want you to see. It's a beautiful thing, and there's a different access to it later on, but it's great. It's a good thing to know. I don't think it's that well known either. I don't think it's that well known, even though in science it's floating around. But you could say, okay, here are voting booths, right? Here's the nearest distance to it or time or whatever. Do that big analysis and then say, look at the residuals. Kind of like Betancourt did for cities. Which places are doing better or worse, given we expect it to be a 2/3 or whatever. Like what kind of exponent should we have for that? It's not simply the density of voting booths should grow up with the density of people, right? There's actually a story for it to be slow. Okay, so how do we supply these things? Right, the airline network with hubs is an approximation of an all-to-all network, right? It's pretty minimal, it's pretty impressive. But just having a few big airports and then little ones, you can get, anywhere in the US with maybe 2 or 3 hops. Get very close, some driving at the ends. And then around the world, you can get most places with 2 or 3 hops. That's kind of impressive, which is, you're trying to, the ideal from a human's point of view would be like you walk outside your house and get into a plane, which is somehow right there. And then you fly to your friend's house and,
Like Amazon.
Which would be an all network, right? Everyone has an airport. Yeah. Sorry.
Amazon would just made a center just south in Mexico, just across the border, so we can ship all their stuff within the U.S. But they just built it close to the border.
They did this?
Yeah, they just did it.
Wow.
I think last year.
Yeah.
It's one of the biggest Amazon center ever built. I can share the link. It's pretty story.
There's a who know? Does anyone listen to Reply All podcast? Who is this character who I see? Is a sort of famous character in the 30s and 40s who was in Kansas and was a big demagogue type character and harnessed radio, sort of put out all of this conspiracy theory stuff and selling. He's a real charlatan, selling all sorts of stuff. I think he made his first fortune by curing infertility in men by inserting goat thingamajigs into them, which required a lot of goats. Eventually, he got people to bring their own goats. But his thing to get around because they shut him down in the US was to put up an enormous, gigantic radio thing in Mexico, just over the border. You could hear it in the Philippines. It's interesting though. It's about the media thing, like how many people you can reach. Yeah. So Amazon is a good example. They've thought about this a lot, right? A lot, because they got to get Bezos up in space. See, which is just a reallocation of stuff. Bezos is really the thing that, right? They're trying to move him somewhere else. That's what it was all about. Just turns out you had to move a lot of other stuff between people, and then the money stuff gets moved around as well. All makes sense. So this is another Newman and Gassner activity where they said, okay, well, let's move stuff around. We're going to have a cost of maintaining airports, for example, and then, you can think of it like that, and the cost of travel, right? So this could be like, so Amazon's we're worried about you have to get it to a center, move it around, or UPS, right? If you have a tracker UPS thing, it's like it does take these kind of amazing journeys, and you're like, my thing is almost at my door, and you find out it's going on this little trip. Oh, okay. So this is sort of the game. Yeah, I guess that's what we had before. This is again, this is a simple little dial. So we'll say the length of the trips, and then the number of hops. So this is exactly what happens when you choose a flight, right? This option is set that you want 0 stops, 1 stop, 2 or more. That's going to boil down to that usually. And then you worry about, and you can think of this as distance or time and so on. And if you don't care about how many, airports you end up in on the way, you cost less and so on. So it depends on your proclivity. And right. So when delta it's just a simple little game. This isn't really reflective of reality, but it's just a little mechanism to play as a trade-off between, you're really worried about how much distance you travel versus how many times you stop. And at that limit of delta equals 1, you don't care about the distance at all, but this is the cost, right? You want to,
So it's also ignoring time.
Yeah, time is sort of folded into here a little bit, and there's a sense of like being in a facility and waiting to get moved. It's sort of folded into that. Yeah.
So there's like random flights where it's like you could have like a 20-something hour delay.
I know. Some very disturbing things come up when right. AI, so good. And this is what they produce, right? So one extreme, let me get it right. Yeah, one extreme. So we're not worried about hops. We're worried about the distance thing. So then you'll have lots of little stops, right? You're not worried about these hops, and transport. The idea of this was underneath it is the population again of the US, and you're trying to get from any one person to any other person. And this is sort of the old, right? This is the male. This is people wandering around like with horses and carts, and then ponies. From what I understand, Atlanta exists as a nexus point, right? I mean, like this is, yeah. And then as you start to say, well, it sucks to stop. I don't want that to happen so much. Then you start to see hubs emerge, and some of these, of course, are real. We're starting to get the real ones that exist. And I think it's Memphis is where FedEx is, for example. Like the different airlines have their own hubs. So you say Kansas City pops up, and at the extreme, where you're really focused on hops, Cincinnati is the yeah, that's where it should, right? That should be shouldn't be DC. It should be, which is some swamp, right? Yeah, it should be there. And this is a fractal thing, right? So in fact, it's only showing the tops of these trees, but in principle, this thing goes all the way down to every individual's little, place. And so there is, depending on what's being done, if you say I want it by ground, like a package, or if you want to drive from, here to LA or whatever, you might do it. You drive, and you're going to do something more like this. Of course, on top of this is that the US kind of made a grid structure, especially out here, right? So this part is a little. What's that?
So that is kind of the route you take.
Yeah, I mean it's not far, but but yeah, it's definitely some big grid things out here, which looks cool on a map, but does suck in terms of you know, I you know, like not feeling the grain of the state, so to speak. All right, so this is work that came. So this is all in the 2000s. This is work that came towards the end of around about 2010. So this is the supply to the most, right? So now we're going to really pile up our McDonald's, feed the humans, where the people are. So it's public versus private, and this is Umanal. So it's a Korean group. So they analyzed data from South Korea and data from the U.S. as a comparison, and they just some things are similar. It's just that they different data sets, I guess. Okay, so it's the same kind of story again. This title, one of these titles that is fine, but it doesn't tell you, right? It doesn't tell you. It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't tell you. At least it's not a question mark. God, I'm sick of that. It's so bad. Clickbait. All right. So they find this isn't really true. So this is something where people have gone, oh, let's look at some more data, which maybe the others did and found that it wasn't right, and they just went, okay, we'll just put that. That didn't happen in the great tradition of science. But they seem to have embraced it, and they have this kind of story that there are these two limiting cases, alpha equals 1. So this is where, in fact, facilities and population are scaling with each other as it gets denser. The facilities pile in linearly. Superlinear would be just a lot. Then you'd have Starbucks on top of Starbucks. So there's a limit. And then pro-social public, so this is what we had before, is 2/3. And so they kind of lay out a little mechanism for how it might kind of range between those things. And so the dial is that you discount the distance that it takes people. So the question before, like that you might have someone who is, really 1,000 miles away, maybe you said like this, right? Then they get even more discounted, right? So this is going to be where we care less about people out in the rural, the least populated areas. So these are a couple of examples. Ambulatory hospitals. So they have something that looks much. This is not the pro-social thing, right? This is like, it's a scaling that, and of course this is rough, and there's no errors on this in particular, but it's just a couple of plots. This is for schools, so this is much more in that kind of case. But you can sort of see it lifting up here. As you get to higher densities, it starts to be, and not a big range. Although, I mean, there are 6 orders of magnitude. There maybe something is happening here where you just start piling in more schools. It's public schools, so yeah, that's what I'm pointing to. So this is U.S. and South Korea, and the one I just showed you is there, and then schools, primary schools that can't be right. No, it's South Korea. So yeah, public schools, here it is, 0.69. So you can see a range of exponents. We're not looking at them. These R-squareds are a little, not brilliant. But things like this, beauty care, laundry, these start to kind of make sense, right? You're really trying to make some money. Private schools are very different to public schools. And then it starts to and then you get to death care. Fire station, police station, right? So these are reasonable, right? This sort of makes more sense. None of these are exactly 2/3, but they're down at that scaling. So these are pieces that have been, you're trying to, they can be sort of looked at, and depending on how they came about, all sorts of stories for how they came about, but the idea that they were, that there was a pro-social kind of public motivation to build them in that way, space them out. Of course, they have to react to changes in population. So I don't know if anyone is from Burlington, right? But or their family is, but it used to be, I think there are 5 elementary schools now. There might have been 12 or 13 at some point, 14 with the lower pop. Everyone had 10 kids, right? And so that's the boomers who in no way imperiled the world. So But a lot of, you see them around, right? I mean, UVM's reclaimed some, there's some chiropractors in some, it's a different, these old brick buildings that were, and part of that is people have cars, they move around a little bit more easily as well. So there's money, there's all sorts of funny things going on, but it's definitely changed in terms of the population of kids. Okay, so I think we've got similar kinds of ones here, and then there's this one I mentioned before, this public health center. Its scaling is like, this is basically zero, right? This is a 0.09. It's basically flat because that was superimposed by the government. They just almost not even regarding geography, right? You have to this would be hard work to do this. Another thing that's kind of like that, I suppose, in the US actually, is weather stations. They're pretty uniformly spread around. I don't think I've talked about it, but we did a whole body of work on what we call the teletherm. You ever heard of that thing? Did I tell you about that? Which is the on average coldest day and warmest day of the year, which for here is about Groundhog Day for the coldest day. It's like July 15 is the hottest day. Anyway, spectacular. It's like solstice, but yeah. Anyway, so sort of makes sense. Parking banks, right? Trying to make money out of people. They're more like one. Yeah. So they have a few stories for this, and I think this is going to be a good little slice. We'll get it in here. So these are the ambulatory hospitals, and this is the Voronoi diagram for them. So you see this much sparser structure here, right? And then this is for public schools, and you can see them, right. It loosens away from the density in here, so that's the kind of fracture away, and yeah, right. And I think there's a bit of an issue. There are just different numbers of hospitals and schools as well, but that's not the thing. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this seemed to be missing. I mean, people have definitely been kind of coming up with this two-thirds thing, 50s, 60s, I think, and we're kind of stuck on it. And so what they come up with this is that, right, you want to minimize distance. You can at least see that minimizing distance gives rise to two-thirds. I'm not saying that that's what's going on, but that argument works. But you want to maximize the number of people who come in if you're a commercial thing. So that's the change. So this is the population, this is the average travel distance, and this is the area. So we had all of these things before, and they just move things around so that this is going to be, instead of just a 1 here, the cost, if you like, for a cell is going to be this average distance to some power. So the justification for this is, well, we're just going to play around with something, right? I'm not saying that there's like how this might come about in reality. So this is a little bit of a game, but at the limits of 1, at 1, we're back to where we were before, and for 0, distance doesn't matter anymore. It's just the number of people. So it switches it off. And if you play around with that, you can get this business as well. It's a similar kind of calculation, but instead of two-thirds, you get 2 over beta plus 2. And so what beta is 1, that's the pro-social one, that's 2 over 1 plus 2, so it's two-thirds. And so this is interesting because the d is the 2, the dimension, but this, what was just simply a 1 before, has now got a story for it as well, and it's this exponent in the weighting of how much you care about how far people travel, and as you dial it back to 0, and you don't care, so someone 1,000 miles away is not going to get Starbucks, then you get 2 over 2 and you get 1. So this is then something that can be a diagnostic, right? What we can do is say, like, we go back to something like this and we say, okay, we think schools should be two-thirds, right? Like, so which ones are off? And, if there's a fit here, like how far are they off that axis as well, right? It's not, so the scaling might be wrong. And then there's simply the residuals, which, this is two orders of magnitude here. These are pretty big variations. So the scaling might be okay, but the residuals tell you a big story as well. So it could be a diagnostic. And then I think there's a more general thing where you say, okay, here's a pattern that we observe in reality. It's something, maybe it's cells, right? Like fire break type things. Maybe it's where facilities are for humans or whatever, and you can look at the population around them. But whatever it is, you have to identify some sort of ambient background thing. So for the population of people, the way they're distributed it would be that. The kind of attack thing of lightning, right? That's the danger aspect of it as well. Could be the background part. And then it's fractured in some way. It's balkanized in some way. And I think the big game there would be to figure out, oh, it's because it's trying, like you should be able to say, oh, this thing is trying to minimize, this is a system that has got some sort of stable kind of arrangement where what's being minimized or maximized, right? You're maximizing the number of people you get in, or you minimize the average distance, or you minimize the average, catastrophe, something like that. So there's sort of benefits and costs and trying to work this out. So it's a potentially you should be able to kind of figure out there's an equipartitioning of risk going on in some way, and then what that kind of exactly what the details are of say this kind of exponent are. And then you might be able to say, look, we think it should be at 2/3 because this should be to help people, right? And you can see like, okay, this state or this is off the axis and clearly something's going wrong. Some of those will be obvious, right? There are laws on the books that changed things, made it better or worse. But I think it could uncover forensically places where sneaky things have happened, and for some reason you have a real lack. McDonald's would like to see this too, right? So it could be used for bad ways. Okay, so I think that's good. It's just something I want you to know about. It's a big story for us, for complex systems in general, and I think it's sort of still waiting for a synthetic work that ties it all together. So maybe put in your noggins and think about it. We often talk about systems, complex system things being, for in StatMech, they were talking about being far from equilibrium, right? These things seem like they're out of balance in some way, but maybe they're not, because there is something that's out of balance, right? With cities to rural areas, in some sense, right? But that's sort of a natural thing that happens, and then something sitting on top of that could actually be equalized. Okay, well, I hope that was exciting for you, and yeah, all right. I guess don't be Aaron Rodgers, and I'll see you here on Thursday. All right. Cool. Cool.